Right. My name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Meredith McGough. We're at Union Wine Company in Tualatin, May 5th, 2021. Meredith, thank you so much for joining us today.
Happy to be here.
First question, most important question to get started is why wine?
Why wine? So my mom likes to take credit for why wine, and in some ways, many ways, rightfully so. My mom's side of my family is Italian, so I've been drinking wine since I was probably too young to be drinking wine, at least in this country. My parents were always happy for us to have, little sips with dinner. And when I was in high school, I went to West Lynn, so not far away, and was trying to decide what I wanted to go to college for. It's such a funny thing that we ask 18-year-olds to figure out, 17-year-olds to figure out what they want to do with the rest of their lives at that age. But my mom and a friend went on a wine trip to Napa actually, and my mom came back and was like, "Did you know that you can go to school for wine?" But I mean, ultimately, I wanted to make wine, decided to study wine because of the combination of art and science. I was always really very interested in the sciences, but also had spent some time visiting wineries in the Willamette Valley with my family and their friends. Since I turned 16, I was designated driver as they'd go wine tasting. So Italian family, and then just sort of meeting people in the wine industry and realizing what a down-to-earth community it was. And I think I'm one of the few actually who studied wine in my class at school who's stuck with it, but because it's not as glamorous as a lot of people think, more idyllic, but yeah. But I ultimately really liked the hard work and sort of dirty, getting dirty and cleaning, and
Tell me about your impressions of the wine industry from when you can remember, when you, like you said, being kind of visiting and being a designated driver. What were your impressions of Oregon wine, first ones you can remember?
A lot of it was just the vineyards and being outside and visiting. It was often visiting Oregon wineries on some of the beautiful days when it felt like we had fewer beautiful days than we do now, but some of the first days in spring, going out and just loving being outside and all the green and all the vegetation, and but then also the sort of hubbub and buzz in tasting rooms and some of the excitement, and I remember being a little bit intimidated, and I remember actually my mom's a feminist through and through, and poor woman, growing up, I was always I'm not a feminist, until I got older and realized, oh yeah, it's important to identify as a feminist. And so I remember actually visiting wineries, and when we would talk to or hear from people who were winemakers, I remember seeing a lot of male winemakers out there, and recognizing even in high school that there were not a lot of women in this field. So in spite of my pushing back against the label of feminist as a young child, I think I was certainly influenced by my mom to really want to break some barriers there, and be a female presence where there was not one, or at least not as visible a one. There certainly was one, but it wasn't something that I remember seeing much of.
So you mentioned that your mom came back with this idea that you could go to school for wine. So were you immediately on board with that, or what was the kind of, after you graduated high school, what was the next step for you?
So I was pretty amenable to it immediately. Even in high school, I was very interested in food and wine, and so a big part of it with my family was that gathering and coming together and sharing a meal, and wine was always a part of that. So it was really easy for me to say, this is a science degree. I can get a Bachelor of Science in winemaking and focus on this. It was very appealing right off the bat. I struggled. I actually was telling someone recently, I matriculated at both UC Davis and Linfield, but there was no formal wine program at Linfield at the time, and I really wanted to be part of the Oregon wine industry. And so there was an appeal. It appealed to me to go to school locally, and even if it wasn't a formal wine program as there is now, I thought, well, I could be around it. Many of my friends in the wine industry now went to Linfield, like almost absorbed wine knowledge and experience by osmosis, or just working harvests and just being in the community. So I very nearly went to Linfield, but ultimately I went to school at Davis, it made some great contacts, and but I definitely didn't. It felt like a degree that was certainly more focused on warmer climate, grape growing, winemaking. So. Yeah, no regrets, because I'm happy with where I ended up, but I've occasionally wondered what would have been different. Yeah.
So tell me about the Davis experience for you then. What were your main takeaways from there, and what was the experience like in terms of the actual classroom and school setting? Well,
the biggest thing actually, and this is more hindsight than, takes my experience into consideration certainly, but I did not get nearly as much out of that education as I could have if I had any degree of practical experience whatsoever before attending school. I mean, anyone that I've talked to about anyone who's interested in pursuing this career, I tell them to go work a harvest or 2 or 3 first, because having that experience to which you can apply the theoretical, the theory that you learn in school, especially, Davis were some practical elements to it, and there's a teaching winery. I was in the old teaching winery. There's a new, beautiful, high tech and very nice teaching winery. I was in Wixon, the old dirty teaching winery, which was cool to actually get to make wine there. That building had so much history and probably prepared me better for what most wineries actually look like, at least in Oregon. It was a lot of theory. I made good connections. I learned a lot. I think a lot more would have stuck if if I'd known what questions to ask or known what challenges arise in a vineyard or in a winery. I also, because of my personality, I wanted to just get finished with school and get to work. I was not great at enjoying my college experience or taking something that I still regret. I took no soil science classes, which now I'm what was I thinking? But I just want to get done as quickly as possible. So I actually finished school in 3 years. Took summer classes, finished school, got my degree, and went to work. The things that we do when we're young. now that I work every day, I wish I'd taken the extra year or 2 that some people take.
There'll always be time to work.
Yeah, exactly. I somehow didn't know that when I was in my early 20s. I finished in about 3 years. I had 1 fall term left to finish up, and I took that term off to go and work a harvest. So I went and worked for Opus One. I had a friend who put me in touch with a contact, and so I took my fall term off, worked what year was that, 2007 vintage at Opus One, and then had basically a growing season, so spring and summer, before I had to go back to school to finish my last term. So I came up to Oregon for the growing season of 2008, worked for a vineyard management company, and then when I went back to school and finished my last term, I had one of the classes I had to take was a wine chemistry lab class, and I was hired back on at Opus One as interim enologist that year. Their enologist left right before harvest, and I was hired to be interim enologist concurrently with my last class at Davis, which was a wine chemistry lab. So I was like it was actually great because I was applying what I was learning in school in my day-to-day work, which was funny.
Awesome.
Yeah, it was good.
Tell me about your first harvest. What was that like in 2007?
I mean, I had no idea what I was doing. I was super intimidated, and I was working at Opus One, which I told you how I found the wine community so down to earth, but then like approaching this, big, beautiful, storied Napa winery, and front of house, everybody, was dressed up in suit and tie, and I pretty quickly recognized that the production staff was also down to earth, and it wasn't that the front of house staff wasn't as well. It was just, the way they had to present themselves. So I was super intimidated, but got more comfortable pretty quickly. Yeah, it was great. I worked a chunk of the season in the vineyard, and then a chunk of the season, when the fruit started to come in, I worked in the winery. So I got a breadth of experience. I actually was just talking to Michael Salacci, the winemaker, who's still the winemaker there, 2 days ago, and realizing how long we've known one another. 2007 was a long time ago now, but he was reminding me that it was probably 3 weeks into my internship, and my car on my way to work, I was living in Sacramento and commuting to Napa, which also silly, again, like I don't know what I was thinking. I was always very current on, up to date on current events, listened to a lot of news in the car. But on my way to work, 3 weeks in, we were bottling. I was supposed to be at work at 5 a.m. or something, so I'd left Sacramento at 3:30 and was supposed to be in Napa early. And my car died. My overheated car died halfway there, and so I called, said I wasn't going to be there on time. I went and I got a rental car. AAA came. I got a rental car, and I got to work, and I was an hour and a half late. But Michael remembered that and still tells that story, because he was like, I don't know anyone who would have done this, whose car would die and you'd still make it to work. I'm like, I had to be here. We're bottling. So that was his first glimpse of my work ethic. But it was a great experience. I mean, Michael's still a friend and mentor, and was a joy to work with. It was also a glimpse into the world of wineries that have the means to do a lot of research and experimentation, and so I really enjoyed that. I mean, I worked there in 2007, but then I worked full-time at Opus One from 2008 until 2011, and it was amazing to have the time and the resources to dedicate to research projects and trials and demos, and because of the high profile of the winery, I mean, vendors treat them very differently, and so it was it was nice to have access to all of the newest technology. Roger Bolton, who I think still has not retired, professor at UC Davis. He is also dear friends with Michael, and so he was around a lot consulting, and it felt like an additional, whatever that was, 8, 9, 10, 11, 4 years of education, as well as practical experience. So it was a good place to work.
In addition to the people, did you find what did you find attractive about the work? What was it about the work that appealed to you?
So, I mean, the research and the interest in furthering quality, I mean, it was always, how can we achieve quality even in small increments? And as enologist, I got to practice the scientific side of it, but there was a lot of creativity as well. I mean, it's where I developed my palate. I learned some of the like the nuances of blending, because that wine is all about blending. And then I came to Oregon and was, I mean, it was new to me to be making wines where, you know, there was an emphasis on single vineyards and choosing the best lot and bottling an individual lot rather than blending to, blending the parts to make the whole. So it was quite formative. Michael also is a pretty sort of silly, creative man, and so we did some work on like texture vocabulary and trying to calibrate the vocabulary of the winemaking team so that we all were talking about the same thing and understanding one another's language. And so like I got to head up this project, which, I mean, it wasn't a huge project, but it was like I went out and got all different makeups and skincare products that were different textures, and we sort of borrowed from some of the language of that industry to work to. And then also I bought a bunch of different fabric swatches, and so we were pulling some other vocabulary into the wine lexicon, which was fun. It felt creative. It always felt super collaborative. And again, like the resources, there's a Frenchman named Alexandre Schmidt, who's better known as Linné. So he's a Ney, which is the perfume industry title. I mean, there's a training that they go through, and so this guy Alexandre came to Napa. He's come to Oregon a couple of times. I tried to entice him when I first arrived here, and so he came and put on a seminar when I was working at A to Z for a group, and then he came for the Oregon Wine Industry Symposium one year and spoke. But I was able to work with him and on sort of some of his dilutions and going through aromatic molecules, and then we would have these staff trainings, olfactory staff trainings at the winery that were it's the education piece and the focus on development and personal development that I think part of it was also early career and not feeling pulled in as many directions and not having quite as much responsibility, and it felt easier to focus on, take 4 hours in the middle of a day and focus on just learning aromas. That becomes a little bit, falls further and further out of reach as careers progress. But it was a cool experience.
At what point did you start to have an idea of maybe what your future would be? What part of the industry you wanted to be in? You mentioned Oregon as always the goal. Was winemaking always what you wanted to do, or did that kind of come to you later?
Yeah, I think, that still evolves, and I mentioned before the interview started, I've been spending more time in the vineyard, and so I think as time has gone on, I have recognized, but a little bit more honest with myself about the lip service that some winemakers pay to the value and importance of the vineyard and spending time in the vineyard, and have wanted to really invest more time in that part of the industry. So I feel like it's then and now. I think that I am not the only one in the industry who struggles with this like wanting to spend more time on the hands-on work, and then being pulled to a computer and email. And so then I wanted to be a winemaker. That was sort of all what I wanted to do. Part of the reason that I didn't take any soil science classes, didn't focus as much on the vit part of the viticulture and enology degree that I do hold. And so I knew I wanted to come back to Oregon, because as much as I enjoyed the wines that we made at Opus One, part of the reason that I enjoyed those wines was that we tended to pick on the earlier side, and I always preferred the cooler vintages in Napa. I loved the 2005 vintage, which was maybe in Napa akin to our 2011 vintage, like a little bit panned by the press immediately, and then has shown amazing longevity and grace and elegance. So I always wanted to come back to Oregon because I like acid, I like cool climate wines. I knew that I didn't want to stay in the lab. I was enologist there, and I was, again, recognized that often women are shunted into the more lab-based positions. So I knew I wanted to come back to Oregon, and then it was difficult to pull myself away from Opus One because of all the things that I described. But I also saw that it was really easy to get sucked into that world and learn and feel like there's, one best way to do things, and I wanted to see other ways of doing things, and then it made my decision pretty easy because my dad was ill and not doing well. So coming back in 2011 was a combination of factors, but it was sort of always planned, always coming.
So when you did decide to come back, what were you looking for in your kind of entree back into Oregon, and what was your first? What were you looking for, and what did you find?
I was looking for, even just the next step forward. I don't think that I quite knew exactly what I was looking for. I think that this is a challenge that even as we've hired, at Union have hired people from out of California, I remember sort of the sticker shock of looking for jobs and realizing that I wasn't going to be making in Oregon what I was making in California, but then also recognized pretty quickly that the Oregon industry, there's a lot. At least then, I think that more jobs are posted now, but then it felt like, and it's still somewhat the case, it helps to have connections. As with anything. And so but I also wanted to, working at Opus One, I had only made red wine, so I also wanted to make white wine, and I love Riesling, and so one of the first things I did was find some fruit to purchase so that I could make some wine. So I bought some Riesling from Lazy River Vineyard in Yamhill, Carlton, AVA, just sort of west of Yamhill there, and made some wine at the Carlton Winemaker Studio, and then I got an harvest enologist at Archery Summit, which was a really cool experience because that was when Anna Matzinger was still the winemaker and Lee Bartholomew was responsible for vineyards, and Kate Payne Brown was assistant winemaker. So it was this badass contingent of Oregon wine industry women. I met my now one of my closest friends, Casey Merrill, working harvest there, who is one of the people I mentioned who went to Linfield and just stayed in wine country, and that was cool to be surrounded by so many women who were just killing it. And then I was working harvest, and then I was like at either end of my day driving out to Carlton and babysitting my wine, which now I think about like some of those long days and how tired I was driving back and forth. Like, that wasn't safe, but also I was younger than I am now, so it was easier to do. But but I also, yeah, it was cool. So I ended up working at Archery Summit for the season and ended up working, I was hired at A to Z the following January because of a connection I'd made at Archery Summit. Anna Matzinger and Michael Davies are married, and Michael hired me at A to Z, so it was, I mean, as these things go, it was, yeah, it worked out well. But I mean, it was 2011, and I definitely, as I was making the decision to harvest my Riesling on November 8th, I remember thinking, like, I don't know if I made the right decision coming back to Oregon. This is I mean, it was a challenging growing season, but now I taste the 2011s, and it was a great vintage to come back to Oregon.
Just didn't feel that way at the time.
It was just, yeah, it was challenging at the time. Yeah.
So tell me about your work at A to Z and kind of, again, your impressions of it. It's such a different place in Oregon wine. What were you doing there, and what was it like at A to Z at that point?
So I was hired as enologist and I was hired as enologist. The assistant winemaker, Blair Trathan, left to become winemaker at Shea 4 months into my time at A to Z, and because I'm generally the person who like sees what needs to be done and I do it. He was leaving, I started writing work orders and sort of quickly fell into the assistant winemaking role, which was, I mean, it was cool. It was great, and it felt very natural, and it was yeah, A to Z was fun. It was fun to see the sort of two facets of the business, A to Z and Rex Hill, and then learn a lot about the business, and to recognize that, you know, one brand can pay the bills, so the other brand can, you know, make the kind of wine that a lot of us want to make. But it was also really cool to make wine that my friends and family that was accessible to friends and family, and that is the biggest difference that I remember coming from Opus One and even Archery Summit. I mean, more within reach than some Napa cabs, but still not inexpensive. Whereas A to Z as a value brand, it was cool to be able to talk to friends and family who were not in the wine industry, which. Not all of us in the wine industry do a good job of this, but I retain a lot of friends who are not in the wine industry. So for yeah, to be able to share that with them was really cool. And A to Z was a great place to work. It was a fun company, a lot of personalities at play, which Amy Prosenjack was a model and was a mentor, and so seeing her and some of her sort of the way that she like moderated meetings was something that really clicked with me, and I still think about her and the way that she manages groups of people and constructive sort of collaborative guidance. So that was cool. It was really fun to work with Michael after having worked with Anna there, and then yeah, of course, like Sam and Cheryl and Bill and Deb. It was a lot of personalities, and it was interesting to be sort of thrown into it as, I mean, Ryan Collins was there at the time as viticulturist, and so like, but he'd been there for a little while, so it was an interesting dynamic to step into, but all really cool people, and yeah, it was fun to see the evolution of that facility as well. I mean, I credit my comfort with marginally controlled chaos to A to Z, which is sort of similar paradigm here at Union. I mean, when I started there were a couple of big tanks, and while I was there, there were, gosh, I don't even remember how many new BT's blending tanks were installed. There was at least one new building, two new buildings that were built out while I was there. So it was fun to see Cheryl managing all of the construction and responsible for all the capital piece of it. Anna Welch Prost, who's now, gosh, I think she's white winemaker. That may still be her title. And then her husband Olivier is red winemaker. So it's a lot of personalities, but really a great place to work. Yeah.
So what came next for you?
Let's see. Well, I was there 2011 until I left in 2015. I got a divorce in 2014. I got married when I was 25, which is part of the reason that I never traveled or worked abroad right when I finished school, and which, I mean, is ironic because it's part of the reason that I wanted, I mean, I didn't mention this before, but part of the reason that so many people, I think, want to study wine is the opportunity to travel and work abroad and gain experience abroad. Nodding. And so I got divorced in 2014, and my dad had passed away in 2011, and sort of both of those things caused me to reevaluate a little bit. And as much as I loved working for A to Z, I also was doing a lot more winemaking from in front of a computer, and wanted to get back to physically making wine, but also wanted to take the opportunity to travel. So I left in August of 2015. I gave them more notice than that. No one should leave a winemaking role in August without plenty of notice. So I left and set out to do some harvest hopping. Mm-hmm. So I turned 30 working harvest in Bordeaux. I so badly wanted to work harvest in Italy, but as an older person, I mean, not that 30 is old, but older than most countries will give easily give a visa. Mm-hmm. So I used an old Napa connection to go work in Bordeaux, and worked the 2015 harvest there. And then from there I went to Tasmania and worked harvest at Bay of Fires, and I was sort of, again, 30 is not old, but I still was kind of harvest mom, like everywhere that I went, because I was working with a bunch of recent graduates or young people who hadn't gone to school yet, who were still trying to figure out what they wanted to do. So I was often the person who was like, here's your glass of water and your Advil for when you wake up in the morning. But it was good. I made some really good friends. So I went to, Bordeaux. I went to Tasmania. I went and spent a couple of months diving and getting a dive master certification in Thailand, and then I had planned actually to go and do a coffee harvest in Hawaii with a family friend, because there's sort of an enzymatic fermentation step in coffee that appealed to me as someone interested in fermentation. But Michael at Opus One asked me to come back. He had someone leaving. He asked me to come fill in for a season. So I did that, which was great. Michael's, again, mentor, friend. It was fun to go back and spend another season there. And then I went and worked a harvest in New Zealand. So spent a couple years harvest hopping and traveling, and remembered why I love winemaking, because when I finally left A to Z, I was wondering if it was something that I wanted to continue to do. I thought, if I'm going to spend all my time sitting in front of a computer, I could be making a hell of a lot more money doing something different. So I was glad to have taken the break, but then pretty quickly also wanted more responsibility and wanted to be able to, see a wine through from start to finish and spend more time in the vineyard. And so I came back to the States, worked the 2017 vintage at Screaming Eagle, and was hired full-time there as enologist. And that was the year that there were the fires. It was a strange season. And I also pretty quickly realized that I wanted to be back in Oregon, that Napa, while there are a lot of really cool things about it, was not exactly where I wanted to be or the kind of wine I wanted to be making. Mm-hmm. So yeah, my friend Cheney Vidrine, who's now my co-winemaker at Union, he came to visit when I was living in Yountville, and I was telling him that I was wanting to maybe come back to Oregon, and he convinced me to come and work a harvest winemaking job at Union. So I came back up here in July of 2018 and have been at Union ever since.
Never left.
Never left. Yeah, they sucked me in.
Well, before I talk about Union, I'm curious. You mentioned kind of an interesting timing for the abroad travel, for the harvest hopping,
Mm-hmm.
not usually doing that after you've already kind of had a career. So
Yeah.
I'm curious for you, you mentioned it kind of like re-sparking for you. What did re-spark in you in terms of like what were you reminded of about what you loved about wine? And what were some of the kind of memorable experiences for you in those couple of years while you were abroad?
Yeah, for sure. Well, so, and actually something that, before I answer that question, I also, having worked abroad as someone with more experience, I learned entirely different things than I would have learned if I had worked abroad when I was, 22. So I think while I learned some different winemaking practices, ideas, I learned and paid a lot more attention to things like management style and the way that staffing was laid out at different wineries, and how interns were treated at different places and what was valuable to interns and as part of that experience. And so I think it allowed me to come back with a really cool perspective and to take away some things that I wouldn't have if I had traveled when I was younger. But and actually, I mean, those connections and the people and the excitement around wine, and just like all of the, being an intern, all of the communal meals and sharing and discussing wine at the table, and debates over quality and preferences, and that was even more than the actual work. It was the communal living and the relationship piece of it that was that I came away feeling most motivated by, because I think I was looking back at some notes from a steamboat conference a couple years ago, certainly not last year, and looking at some notes, and I had written at the bottom of my page of notes, I should be doing something more meaningful with my life. And I have that thought every so often, but then I also remember where I do derive meaning, and so I also like being able to say it's just wine, and at the end of the day, nobody's, we're not saving lives here. It's just wine, so no need to be totally stressed out about it, even though sometimes that's hard to remember. But but like there is meaning in what we do, in the connections that we form, and the piece of what we do that is bringing people together and memory. And so, gosh, I'm like talking about my travels and thinking about them and starting to tear up a little bit. That is weird. But yeah, so I mean, the most memorable parts of that are like going on adventures with the other interns and harvest staff. When I was working in Tasmania, going on a trip with the house to our entire crew to Bay of Fires, and everybody, you know, camping and hiking, and that was another fun one where I clearly don't mind being the only woman in a group. It was me and seven guys, so I was well and truly harvest mom. But there was, when we first started, there was a dead possum. Which one do we have? Possums or opossums? There's one that we have, and then there's the one that they have in Australia. And it was, I mean, the thing was giant and was dead behind a tank, and it smelled terrible. The doors had been left open, and all the guys were like, oh, I'm gonna go, and like trying to find a shovel to move it. And I just went and like got some rubber gloves and picked it up and took it outside. So I have this great picture of me holding a giant dead animal. So gross, but like one of my fondest memories, because it was hilarious and very memorable. But yeah, I mean, it's hard to like identify some specific. I mean, in Bordeaux, going mushroom hunting with other interns, things that, more the connection to people than even anything specific to the wine itself. I mean, it didn't hurt to walk away at the end of the day feeling like I'd been paid to work out. And I look back at pictures of myself and like I was ripped. That was awesome. I would love to do more of that. But yeah, the best part of it was for sure the people.
So at this point, you've had a lot of different wine experiences, a lot of different places, and you've come across a lot of different people. You mentioned kind of one thing you were watching for was like management style and that kind of thing. I'm curious about sort of the winemaking part of things, and if you had what your winemaking philosophy as it was developing, what it would look like, and how these experiences played into what your eventual winemaking philosophy would be.
So I sort of learned that there is a place for everything. Like, it allowed me to recognize and understand that that there are situations where it's best to be hands off, and there are situations where you need to be more involved and more hands-on and need to make a wine a little bit more. And it allowed me to develop a sense of where each of those is appropriate, and to really take a step back and look at the goal of, where a specific lot of fruit is going to go, or when evaluating a lot of wine and or blending, to separate myself from personal preference and recognize what the intention of a given wine is, which I've found incredibly valuable at Union, because Union is this umbrella that sits over multiple brands. And so while I might prefer one thing, the consumer of a specific wine might prefer another. And so being able to put myself in that headspace as I'm tasting and to discuss with the winemaking team and be able to bring that back into focus and think about a specific style rather than just, I think it's really easy to say like, oh no, I don't like this and I prefer this. But it's a more challenging mental exercise to make decisions based on what the final goal is and what the purpose is. So being able to see all of these different, to work in some very different places and see, it's made me realize how important it is to define that intention and define that goal as well, because that without those explicitly defined, it makes it impossible to take the step back that is necessary and make winemaking decisions based on that rather than personal preference.
So you mentioned you started here at Union at a harvest internship. Tell me about initial impressions and initial work here and sort of the progression for you in your career once you got here.
Sure. So I was harvest winemaker, which meant that I was running the swing shift. And I pretty quickly felt very comfortable in what I described as marginally controlled chaos. I mean, that's maybe not fair. It's better controlled chaos than I give it credit for, but it pretty quickly felt very comfortable because of the experience I'd had at A to Z and at another winery that was in the middle of major growth phase. And I was working for, my friend Cheney enticed me to join, but JP Caldcleugh was our director of winemaking, and so working for him I also was very comfortable because he was a very hands-off manager, and I am happy to be autonomous and just get shit done. So I pretty quickly felt comfortable with doing my part to help keep things organized and overseeing a crew. And I had learned also from my time working abroad as someone with experience in the industry how to lead by example and lead from sort of behind or laterally, because as an intern abroad, I wasn't ever in a position to say, I wasn't in a position of power, but I also had more experience than most of the people that I was working with. And so I found a way to manage people without explicitly managing them, which I think is we could all still use some work in that, but I think it's a valuable skill to have. And so it made I think it made my initial job at Union pretty easy, but then not easy. Nothing about that harvest was easy, but it made it an easy transition at least. But then also I think has played into my progression at the company. So I was hired as harvest winemaker, and then actually I at the end of harvest they didn't need another winemaker, but the packaging facility where we are now was in its sort of nascent stages, and so Union needed a packaging facility manager basically, and JP sort of couched it in such a way that I could be involved in winemaking as well. So my title is production winemaker, but it actually meant that I managed the packaging facility for 2 years, which was not necessarily what I was looking for, but it was amazing experience. I learned so much about bottling less so because we were still using a mobile line at the time. We now have our own filler in place, but about canning. Union started putting wine in can in 2013 with like a small run for Feast Portland. Actually, funny side note about that, that was actually wine that was canned in an illegally sized format, because most cans are a 12-ounce can, and until very recently, until just a couple months ago, well, till the end of 2020, we could only put wine in specifically defined formats, and so the union's first production run was wine in a 12-ounce can, which I always think is funny, but it was a teeny tiny production. But yeah, I was here for 2 years getting the packaging line up and running, and staffing the facility and putting some systems in place, but also learning more than I ever thought that I would learn about canning wine and all the equipment that goes along with it. And yeah, I think a lot of winemakers don't love packaging season or bottling season, because it's stressful and there are a lot of moving parts, and I'm glad to have done this at the very least, if it means that I don't need to ever be stressed out about packaging again, because it was my everyday for 2 years. So yeah, and then so I was here for 2 years, but I wasn't necessarily, it was great and I learned a ton. And I'm very happy that I was given the opportunity to do it. I was also probably not necessarily the best choice for union, because I was a winemaker. I was not someone who had any background in packaging, but we got through and we got it up and running. We now have a wonderful packaging manager, who also, his background is more in winemaking than packaging, but he also installed elevators for a long time, which amazingly actually also has an applicable skill set to the packaging line. And then, JP left in December to move to Panama. He and his wife bought a 4-bedroom inn and moved to Panama in December, which not jealous at all. But with his departure, Cheney and I were promoted to winemaker, and as part of that, I'm overseeing our growers, but then we also are in the process of, set to close any day now, on a vineyard out in Sheridan. And we own Amity, which all of our leased and owned vineyards to this point have been farmed by vineyard management companies. But this new property, we are farming ourselves. So we're building a vineyard department, and so that's the new challenge that I get to be responsible for. It's a good evolution.
You've seen it all at this point. You've been in every part of this.
I feel like there's always more, but I'm like, I want to understand every facet of this industry, which there's no possible way. But
you made a pretty good start on that, I think, at this point.
Working on it.
You mentioned canned wine, obviously something that Union is very well known for. Tell me about the evolution of the canned wine program, and about sort of the reaction to the canned wine program from consumers and from the rest of the industry. Yeah,
I wish that I had more direct knowledge of some of the early years. I know that it was a challenge. I've only been here since 2018, and 2013 was the first year that we sort of did this a little bit. But some of the early challenges were just sourcing packaging materials. As I mentioned, the standard can is 12 ounces, and we need a 375 milliliter can, or a 250 milliliter can. But so initially we were sourcing materials from internationally, which was a challenge, and also not something that we wanted to do sustainability-wise. One of the things that appeals to me about wine in a can, and one of the things that we've only sort of really started to talk about as a company, even though it's always been a driving factor, is the sustainability aspect. We can fit almost twice as much wine in a can on a truckload going from the West Coast to the East Coast as we can in a bottle, because of both footprint and weight. Aluminum is much more easily recyclable than glass. and this is a company that is based in Oregon, and a lot of people like to spend time outdoors, and so it's great to take canned wine backpacking and to the beach, and it's great for venues where they don't allow glass. So lots and lots of upside, but certainly I know that it was and has been. There's a level of acceptance now that only continues to increase. Even from the time I started 2 years ago to, has it been almost 3 years now, to now, the number of people that I hear say, "Oh, it's not bad for wine in a can," or "It's good for wine in a can." I don't hear that appended to the end of that sentence quite as much. So that's good. The industry has clearly embraced it and is moving in that direction, which is good to see. As consumer acceptance increases and the industry gets on board, we're seeing more competition in the market, which is, it's competition, but it's good competition. It's good that for a lot of reasons that include the sustainability facet included, that the industry is more open to it. So, it's, and then, it started small for Feast. We were making, we're packaging the wine in California at a co-packer down there, and first of all, transporting the wine down there and not being able to, we would send someone down. This all sort of ended right around the time that I started because we had our own canning line and we were able to bring it in-house, but we would have to send someone down to the co-packer to, keep an eye on things and check final chemistry and all of that before it went to package. And now while we're still transporting the wine from the winery, it's only 2.5 miles rather than all the way to the Central Valley in California. So that has both, it has made sense in a lot of ways, but it also has fortunately coincided with sort of a boom where now we're certainly producing more wine in can than in bottle. The bubbles and rosé bubbles have blown up over the last year, which is a good problem to have, but we're trying to keep up.
So with your new role, you mentioned the kind of overseeing sort of the vineyard side and the new side. Tell me about how you see your new role unfolding with the new property you're buying and the kind of upcoming. How you see your new role unfolding over the next few years.
I would like to be able to dedicate more time than we have historically had to dedicate in the past to those relationships with our growers, but then also in developing our own property. The property that we're purchasing is there's some existing acreage, but there's some development as well, and so some of the longer term fruit sourcing and maintaining these relationships, that's all going to take work. We've also are shifting some of a lot of what we're doing to more focus on sustainability. So I am, this is more the computer part than actually being out in the vineyard, but sort of revising some of our contracts with growers in ways that that work for them, but that are also entail some environmental and social responsibility. Being in a position of responsibility for the fruit supply, which is really the foundation of all that we do here, is a huge amount of responsibility, and also requires a lot of capacity and demand planning at the winery. So when I was at the packaging facility, it was a lot of getting over day-to-day hurdles, and now it's a lot more like looking out and planning 3, 5, 7 years into the future. Certainly not alone, but working with Cheney and working with Ryan and Eric, the Harms brothers, and our sales team, and just like looking out a little bit, well, a lot further. I mean, one of the cool things about the wine industry, but also occasionally frustrating things, is that it is such a long cycle. And so looking at developing, planting more vines, and looking at what that means for the future of the company, and where and when those vineyards will come online is, it's a fun puzzle.
So I want to talk for a second about 2020, which I know is a topic every winemaker loves talking about, because 2020 was so much fun for all of us. So I want to start with COVID and sort of its impacts on your work and on the work here, and sort of from what your perspective, what you saw, how you saw it impact the industry.
Yeah, 2020. 2020 was it was a strange, it was a little bit of a fine line between, like, I don't feel like we're essential workers. Like, even in spite of the fact that, like, as winemakers, as production workers, we classified as essential workers because we're making a food product. And I've heard many people say, oh, for sure, wine was, like, you're essential workers. This was essential during the pandemic. Also, have had many conversations where, we're all sort of saying, we're like, what we're doing is not essential. So, and not from the standpoint of like, we don't need to be here, but also sort of like, how can we make sure that we're keeping everybody as safe as possible? But then also, thank goodness we're classified as essential workers, because we feel very fortunate to have, kept a job, and I actually even been busier than ever. I mean, at Union, we are also very fortunate in that so much of our business is off-premise compared with on-premise. So 2020 was not, was kinder to us than to many of our friends in the industry. And so we saw business boom. I mean, like I said, we're just trying to keep up with the demand for the canned wines in particular, but most of our wines. We shut down in the end of March last year for about a month. We were fortunately in a really good inventory position at the winery, so we were able to close and take about a month off, even the production staff. The company continued to pay all of the staff through that time, which was amazing that we were in a position of financial health to be able to do that, and also I think speaks to the ethics of this company. So we took the month off to sort of reevaluate and work out some procedures and put safety measures in place and gather the appropriate PPE, which those of us in the wine industry have always sort of been familiar with PPE, and now the entire world knows what personal protective equipment is, thanks to the pandemic. But I mean, it was certainly scary coming back to work. We were training some new people, and a lot of what we do requires some, we were trying to figure out how we do our job spaced out, and we got there, and everyone's made it through safely, but it was certainly scary. But also, I think most of the staff recognized that sort of line that I talked about, we're not really essential, but thank goodness I have a job. So, so at packaging, there was that, and in the cellar, much the same. I mean, it was a little bit easier. Well, I won't say easy. I mean, in the cellar, the biggest stress and challenges were around harvest, and Joanna Engel, who's now our assistant winemaker, and who was our enologist through 2020, and then our assistant winemaker, Caitlin O'Brien, both spent countless hours and amounts of energy preparing for harvest and leading the charge on that and outlining best practices and moving us to paperless as much as possible. And we scheduled so that because we run 24 hours during harvest, so we typically run 3 8-hour shifts. Last year we just ran 2 shifts and had an hour between for sanitation and wipe down. We had people working on in different areas of the winery so that we were able to create sort of pods, and then of course there were the fires and the smoke, and so we closed the winery and stopped picking for a couple of days with just some minimal staff coming in to check on things. But gosh, I talked about 2017 in Napa. I thought I was leaving all of that behind me. It was certainly scary to everyone to see it up here as well, and many of our growers, and we work with Northwest Distribution Services, truck drivers, people who were evacuated and lost homes. Everyone, again, fortunately was safe, but one of our growers, you can see where the forest is charred from his property. It's it was scary, and it was also, though, again, one of the nice things about being a larger winery we purchase fruit from all over the state for the Underwood brand. And so we fortunately or unfortunately, however you want to look at it, have experience with smoke affected fruit from years past in Southern Oregon. Mm-hmm. So we were, again, in a better position than many because we had experience with it, and we had some protocols outlined within the winery of how to address that fruit, and some remediation. And then we also, because there was also the extremely low yields that we had to contend with in 2020. We also, where many wineries dropped fruit contracts, we were in a position to be able to support growers and pick up some of those contracts, and we got some fruit from a couple of growers who otherwise would have been out of luck. So at the very least, we didn't, we weren't trying to scalp anybody, but we had a couple of growers come to us and say, I had this this contract dropped, and do you have a home for it? So we were able to purchase some additional fruit and make wine out of it. So it was a tough year for everyone, but for many of those reasons, and because of the scale of what we do and because of our position in the market, it made it, again, perhaps less painful for us than many, even though probably wouldn't have said that in the moment. We've talked about sort of blessing in disguise the low yields of 2020 as well, because a lot of wineries were not in a position to be purchasing additional tonnage because of the pandemic, and it'll be a short vintage. We'll move through it quickly, so with some of the smoke effect and remediation that a lot of wineries of our scale have had to put into their winemaking, at least it'll be a short vintage, and hopefully we can put 2020 behind us quickly.
In every way.
In every way. Yeah.
So tell me about the changes you've seen in the Oregon wine industry from your first impressions of it, and then first impressions of it when you worked here to now. What's changed, and what does the industry look like now compared to maybe when you first were aware of it?
Well, there are a lot more wineries now than there were when I was first aware of it. I mean, there are still, like, I am often amazed. There are brands that, Oregon brands now that I'll see bottles out there and I'm like, I don't recognize it. There are more brands, more wines being made in this state than I can keep track of, which, I mean, is good for the industry that there's interest in Oregon wine. Sometimes it feels like the toothpaste aisle, though, like just more options than anyone can possibly choose from. But I think that's cool. Recently, it feels like there's been more interest in other varieties than the typical Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, and even Chardonnay. I mean, it's been nice to see some of the growth of Chardonnay in the Oregon industry, but yeah, I've enjoyed seeing some of the alternative varieties. I've been always a big fan of John Paul at Cameron and his commitment to growing Nebbiolo in the Willamette Valley. He's the only person who doesn't think I'm crazy for wanting to do the same. But Climate's going in the right direction for it, I guess, and he's made some really cool, varietally distinct Nebbiolo from his property. So that's cool. And then some of the wines coming out of Southern Oregon. There are some really amazing and great quality wines coming out of the Southern Oregon Appalachians. So I was just down there on Thursday and Friday visiting vineyards and got to meet some really cool women. There was a sort of a women in wine networking event, and there are some really cool stories and great wines coming out of that part of the state. So that's been interesting to see develop. And then, so speaking of women in wine, so I'm also president of Women in Wine Oregon, which is an industry organization, nonprofit, that was formed in 2019, the first, and for the last 2 years it's been focused around just one annual event. In July, Willamette Valley Vineyards hosted the first event in person, and then last year we pretty quickly pivoted to a virtual, as so many people did. But this year we're sort of have been expanding programming with some community engagement work, and so this event in Southern Oregon was the first of those, and came off really well. And then we just launched ticket sales for the 2021 event, which is going to be virtual again, but we're working on building out a formal mentorship program, and it has been really cool to see the evolution of the industry in terms of diversity. I mean, as we know from many conversations over the last year, and lots of those uncomfortable conversations about how much further we have to go, but I think as an industry in Oregon, there has been some movement on that front, at least since I've been here. I mean, just looking at the Women in Wine board when I began, Amy Prosenjack is no longer on the board, but she was on the board when I started, and she's how I ended up president. I think she volunteered me. But we have had women on the board who were heading up wineries, some of the largest in key positions in some of the largest wineries in the state. Amy Prosenjack, Brianna Seeley, we talked about, she was at Adelsheim and now is at Argyle. Christine Clare at Willamette Valley Vineyards. Allison Sokolblosser. So a lot more visibility, certainly from a gender representation standpoint. And I think Oregon continues to, and I continue to see a focus there, which is great, and especially after after the last year and sort of this confrontation with, or like recognition and racial reckoning, we need to do better. It's been really cool to see iVoy get established and start to take hold. I've seen, I think there's a lot more familiarity within the industry of with that organization. I mean, they've gained a fair bit of press and are doing. I mean, their mission is really cool. So, and it sounds like they're working to expand programming outside of just the vineyard for the Hispanic and Latinx community. Because there are a couple of staff at Union that I'm like, I would love to get involved in a program, but they're not vineyard based. So, the industry is changing, and I think mostly in a positive direction.
You mentioned kind of throughout the interview, kind of being a woman in a man's world a little bit with your education and with the places you've worked. A lot of times being the only woman. I'm curious in your experiences. What was getting better being a woman in your role? In what way? And what are the biggest challenges still to overcome from your perspective?
Yeah, sure.
It's a big question.
It is a big question. So, I mean, it's getting better in that there is just more, as with any facet, I mean, any need for diversity, seeing someone who looks like you in a role that you aspire to is like really the first step in understanding and feeling like it is possible to get there yourself. I mean, one of the reasons that like it's so powerful to see Kamala Harris in the White House, right? Like being able to see that it's possible, and so seeing more women in positions of, in leadership positions within the industry is huge and makes it a lot easier. And seeing those women as mentors. I mean, I talked about the formal mentorship program that we're working on with Women in Wine, but all of the informal mentorship that goes on within this industry, because, I mean, going back to the connections piece of what we do, I think as an industry that is so focused on personal connection, there have been a lot of women in this industry who've put concerted effort into mentoring and developing and supporting other women in the industry. So that is huge. But then also seeing men in the industry who are taking that step forward and who are in this, I've heard many times, like, I want to help, I don't know how, I don't want to be, I don't want to get in the way, I don't want to say the wrong thing. Like, we all have to get comfortable with being more, get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. It has to be okay to say the wrong thing and then learn that it was the wrong thing and continue to try to support in whatever way that we can. So it's been, cool to be able to have and it has become easier to have those conversations with both women and men in the industry. I mean, in ways that it's still a challenge. Running the packaging facility, I saw it very regularly with some of our suppliers and just some of the assumptions that are made, and I mean, I've talked a lot about how much I've enjoyed many of the companies I've worked for, but one of the things I enjoy about working for this company is I've had these conversations with Ryan where he is of the same mind that I am, that we don't have to work with people we don't enjoy working with. I mean, it's great to hear an owner say that, because I think for a lot of people that's the benefit of having your own company, is you don't have to work with people you don't like. But it has been nice to have that support here, just in terms of relationships with vendors and that piece of it. I think challenges that still exist include, I mean, are not industry specific. I mean, they include things like childcare and parental leave. I mean, again, union. I'm like, sounds like a Union Wine Company commercial, but Union provides parental leave, 3 months of parental leave for either parent. So to be able to, we've just had a cellar hand leave because his wife had a baby and he's going to be gone for 3 months. One of our packaging facility shift leads is going to be out for 3 months around harvest time because his partner is having a baby. So being able to provide some of those resources. But then also, I mean, in promotion and hiring and the way that we either lobby for ourselves or don't, I mean, women still often are promoted based on their accomplishments, whereas men tend to be promoted based on gosh, the word is eluding me, but based on their abilities and based on their potential. And so I think that some of those things are just greater shifts in the way that everyone, we all need to approach the way that we do business and the way that we manage and the way that we lead. And just continuing to talk about it. I mean, the Women in Wine conference, my biggest piece of constructive criticism from the time I attended as an attendee in 2019 and to now, having some of these conversations about the messaging and how we message that it is an event for both men and women, because if we're going to continue to make strides, we need support from the men in this industry as well. Mm-hmm. So, I think a lot has improved, and I think that there's still a long way to go. But being more comfortable, being uncomfortable has been. I mean, we were talking more about 2020, but even in working in a more male-dominated industry, that is something that it's a muscle that I've been working on for sure. Mm-hmm. So.
Mm-hmm. So you talked a little bit about kind of the future for your role here. I'm curious, as you look ahead for yourself beyond that, what else do you see? What else are you looking forward to? What else are you hoping for as you look ahead? Is there more Riesling in the future coming out from your brand, or what's going on? What's happening next?
Oh, I don't know. It is. I mean, because I like to throw myself into work, I don't always make time for. It's harder to make time for like a personal project. Cheney and I both have had, personal projects on the side and have allowed them to expire because it's so easy to get pulled into the day job. But I don't know, maybe I would love to grow Nebbiolo in the Willamette Valley. Doing that would be really cool. But I also I love to make wine. I don't love to sell wine, but my significant other is in wine sales. So hey, maybe at some point. But my mom is moving to Italy at the end of the summer because she's obtained her citizenship and I'm applying for my citizenship. So maybe one day down the road, at the very least a harvest in Italy. I mentioned when I was talking about traveling abroad. I love Oregon wine, but still drink probably more Italian wine at home than Oregon wine. I am very comfortable with ambiguity, and so that's been one of the fun things about this job is that there is never a dull moment, and there's always a surprise. And as much as we plan, things come up. So, there's a lot more to work through at the packaging facility. There's a lot of capacity and resource planning to do, but there's also there's also always something new around the corner. So I don't know what that is yet, but I'm looking forward to finding out what it is. I occasionally think about wanting my own vineyard, because being able to be in a position of like involvement from really truly from beginning to end, planting to bottling and selling, it feels like, occasionally feels like it certainly feels like the most honest way to do what we do as a craft rather than as just a job. And so that is appealing, but also, I know and see and experience how much work goes into every step of that process. And so that is maybe the sort of idyllic future, but it's certainly not something that feels within reach with a job as big as the one that I feel like I have laid out before me right now. So maybe one day, but I've got plenty of career left. So.
All right, was all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover here today that we should have covered?
That's a great question.
Open mic.
Wow. Yeah. Man. Yeah, I don't know. I can't. We covered a lot of ground.
We did.
All good.
We did.
Yeah.
Well, excellent.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time,
thank
for
you.
your thoughtful answers and your candor. Really appreciate that, and we'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.